Hi everyone, Jake Wiv, and welcome to week 5 of the UDL Chat IE Summer Book Club. The book we are reading is Universal Design for Learning, Theory and Practice, and you can get a free multimedia version of the book on the cast.org website. Today I am talking about Chapter 5, Framework for UDL Implementation, and the strategy that I'm using, as you can see, is a PowerPoint presentation. I did say a few weeks ago that I personally didn't like the PowerPoint presentation as a means for my engagement, but having read the chapter, I actually felt this was the best option in terms of representation and engagement for you. I just felt that it kind of needed visuals for you as we were going through, for you to be able to see and read what I was talking about, and that would also help it sustain your interest as we were going through it. What I have done in this PowerPoint presentation is I have swapped out the UDL guidelines from chapter 5 for the most up-to-date version, the 2018 version on the cast.org website, just because there are some changes in them. So just the visuals we're talking about are the most up-to-date ones, and it does mean that I have tweaked some of the things that the authors have said in the book in terms of the new outline, and I've left out other aspects that referred to the language in the older version. And then the final thing, because you know I always have an opinion, is that for me, I think it's really important to think about UDL in terms of enactment instead of in terms of implementation, because as teachers and educators, we often feel that something is sent down from a high and we just have to do it and put it in place, and that is, you implement it and you get on with things, and you often then move on to something else that you need to implement. Enactment it's about that active participation and that active voice in what you were doing, and that it is ongoing, and it is because you have taken a role within it and you can see the relevance, the job relevance for you and the benefits it has to your learners. So just, even though this chapter says implementation, if you could think about it in terms of enactment as we are going through it, that would be great as well. So this chapter is really about how the UDL guidelines help us when we are designing for optimal learning environments and optimal inclusive learning environments with many different paths and options. And I think that part is really important. It's that, yes, we are all working towards the same destination, the same goal, or the same learning outcome, but where students start and how students get there are different experiences and journeys for everyone. So it's not like everyone starts on point A and you put in the options and they follow a linear path to get to point D. And if you recall last week, I talked about the GPS analogy, and how that, reroutes us and gives us our options before we begin our journey. So think about it this way: we're at the end of lockdown, and everyone is traveling now to have reunions with families and friends. So let's just say we are having a reunion down in Kerry. But people are coming from all over the country to catch up with each other. So you have people traveling from Dublin, from Galway, from Limerick, from Tipperary. But not only are they all starting at different destinations, they're also using different means to get there. So some are driving, some are using public transport, a bus or a train. And even for those who are using the same form of transport from the same destination, from the same starting point, so two people are traveling together by car from Dublin, the experience and the journey of the driver is going to be different to the experience and the journey of the passenger in that same car. So that's why those paths and options, and remembering that they are different and they are varied, is really, really important. So what the guideline is helping us to do is provide a framework for us to think systematically about individual and predictable variability as it relates to the learning and how it relates to the context. So again, the context of getting to Kerry is different for everybody who's going on that trip, but the end destination or the goal is the same. It's to get to Kerry, but more importantly, it's to have that reunion with your family and friends. So just remembering that part there, that it is how it relates to the learning and the context. And if we remember that, we can use the guidelines as a means of scaffolding for ourselves to remember who and what to consider when designing. So yes, the who, the students and learners, are the center of all of this, and they are the primary focus. But to get it right for the students, we have to consider the what. So we have to consider the specifics of what it is that we want the students to be able to do at the end of the lesson or the module of lessons. We have to consider the context in which this is occurring, and we have to design with that and the relationship of that context with the student and vice versa when we are doing the designing. And if we consider that, the guidelines will enable us to choose a few guidelines that work well with a particular lesson or activity. So we talked earlier about not overwhelming ourselves or our students, and you don't have to use every guideline or every checkpoint in every lesson. This is intentional design and it's systematic, and you are planning it. So it is about choosing those guidelines or even a checkpoint or two within guidelines that work well with a particular lesson and activity, while bearing in mind the variability of the students that are in front of you. And what the guidelines are doing is they're providing us with those concrete suggestions in the form of the checkpoints for how we can address this systematic and this predictable variability among our students. What it is really important to remember is that they are suggested checkpoints, and the authors in the book are very clear to say that the guidelines are constantly evolving, the language in them evolves, the checkpoints evolves. As I said earlier, I'm using the 2018 version when we get on to the visuals, which has some language changes and even the changes in the hierarchy. Hierarchy is not a good word because this is all equal, for want of a better word, but in how they ordered the different guidelines under each principle, that has changed in the 2018 version to the version in the books. So what the authors are suggesting we can do is use the guidelines as a lens to view anything that we are going to be teaching or doing with our students. And if we do that, so if we think about this in terms of the mindset that we talked about earlier in earlier chapters, then if we are systematically asking ourselves, is this being inclusive? Is this doing what I want it to do? Is it being specific? Are there options there that meet the variability and the diversity of the learners in front of me? Then we are being intentional in our design to create that optimal learning environment for all of the students. So although the guidelines and the checkpoints are an articulation of how students can improve instruction by building flexibility into the learning environment, it is about remembering that students differ in the amount and the types of choice they want. So going back to those choosing a few. And remembering that maybe some students want a lot of choices and other students do better with only a few options. And I remember having this conversation with a teacher not so far back when they were saying what happens if they can't choose. And that's where actually you can put in the supports around self-regulation and goal setting for the student. So if 4 choices is too much for a particular student, then give them 2 choices. If they are managing on that, then you could build it to 3 if you think that it is optimal for that student. So it's just getting the right balance, and it does take a tweak here and there in the beginning, but if we always have that lens on, that inclusive and that flexible and option lens on, then we know that we are working in the right direction for the students. What is really important and a good reminder is that we don't even have to know our particular students to plan for the range of variability in a given learning environment, because as we discussed in earlier chapters, there is that predictable variability, that it is there so that we can intentionally design for predictable variability. And yes, there will still be some of our students with our most complex needs who will need additional support, and we're not negating that. It is about saying that I can provide this optimal learning environment and provide these options for my students if I think in terms of variability and diversity instead of thinking in terms of ability and disability. So I'm just going to play a video here, just kind of a synopsis of what I've said around using the guidelines to guide teaching practice. And this video is on page 58 of the UDL Theory and Practice book.
The UDL Guidelines are meant to scaffold educators in fostering learning environments that benefit all learners. Alexis Reed uses the guidelines as an instructive guide for her teaching practice.
The way that I look at using the guidelines in any of my practice is to use it as a lens to view anything that I'm going to be doing, whether it's going to be some kind of activity or project that I'm going to be implementing in whatever class I'm working in, whether it's at a college or graduate level, or I'm working with in-service teachers, or even with my younger 5th and 6th graders. What I'm really doing is I'm considering all of these different guidelines. So even though I might not have every single thing memorized, I have this to go back to, and it creates that lens for me to develop, explore, and implement everything that I do in my teaching practice.
So moving on then to the guidelines and 3 UDL principles themselves. Each of the 9 guidelines emphasizes areas for learner variability that could present barriers, or in a well-designed learning experience, present leverage points and opportunities for optimal learning and engagement for students with their learning. And the guidelines suggest specific practices for enactment, and that's going back to those multiple checkpoints. But remembering these checkpoints are not meant to be exhaustive, that we can go outside this, and this again is the joy of UDL. It is responsive and it is iterative, so we are always reviewing and we are always moving and changing with the times. Going back to that mindset or lens of our practice, the guidelines can also be used to look at key inclusive practice questions that each guideline can answer for us. And if we consider those questions when planning, it means that we're ensuring flexible, inclusive learning environments for everyone who is in our classroom or our lecture hall. And I was at a UDL session last night as part of the CAS symposium, and I just went to the introduction one as a refresher. Always nice to go back and just see what has changed. And one of the presenters talked about Monday Someday, and I'd really like you to keep that in mind as we move through the 3 guidelines. So what he said, Neil was his name, what he said was, okay, so it's Sunday night. You've got your plan in front of you for Monday morning's lesson. It's not perfect and you'd like to make a change, but you don't have the time. So for Monday, what is that one UDL practice change that you would make to that lesson to make it more inclusive and flexible for all of the learners in front of you? And then look at that plan or a module of work and think someday. What is your blue sky thinking? What is your optimal learning design that you will have in place someday? And what I really liked about that is that this is a slow boil. We don't have to go look at our plans and change absolutely everything, that we just think Monday, one practice change. What will that be? What will be most beneficial in my change for my learners? And then what am I aiming for to have someday in the near future? So looking at the guidelines again, and just a reminder, as I said, these are the 2018 visuals here, not the ones from the book. And the authors were linking it back to the neuroscience chapter. I think that was chapter 3. They were linking it back to that neuroscience chapter where we were talking about the affective, the recognition, and the strategic. So the effect principle, as we know, is multiple means of engagement. And the 3 guidelines are, number 1, recruit interest. So that's recruiting learners' interest with relevance, choice, and removing distractions. The second one is sustaining effort and persistence. So sustain learners' effort and persistence by providing feedback, heightened salience of goals, and collaborating. And the third is self-regulation, and that supports self-regulated learners' self-assessment, reflection, and coping skills. Okay, so let's twist that now back to the lens and the questions. And these questions are taken from the chapter. So if we think about UDL as a lens on connecting learners with the learning, then think about how learners will engage with the lesson. Does the lesson provide options that can help all learners regulate their own learning? And if it doesn't, what options could be added to recruit the interest of your learners? Does the lesson provide options that help all learners sustain effort and motivation? And if not, what options could be added to support learners to sustain effort and persistence while learning? And then finally, does the lesson provide options that engage and interest all learners? And if not, what options could be added to support learners to self-regulate while learning? And again, think about the Monday someday. If you were to make one change, if you were to answer one of those questions now, which would it be? And then start building from there. Going on to our multiple means of representation, the principle of recognition. Again, our 3 guidelines. The first one is perception, so provide multiple ways for learners to access information, including visual and auditory. And we know there is more than that, so they're just 2 examples. The second guideline, language and symbols, and in the previous version they had mathematical language in there as well. Provide ways to clarify language, vocabulary, and symbols that can be a barrier to understanding content. And then the third guideline, comprehension. Support comprehension by allowing the learner to develop background knowledge, highlight patterns, and generalize content. Now, again, flip it to the lens and think about the guidelines as a lens on how you deliver your content. And think about how information is presented by you to the learners. And 3 questions here. Does the information provide options that help all learners reach higher levels of comprehension and understanding? And if not, what options could be added to ensure all learners can perceive the curricular content? The second question, does the information provide options that help all learners understand the symbols and expressions? And if not, what options could you add to ensure all learners understand the language and symbols embedded in the content? And then finally, does the information provide options that help all learners perceive what needs to be learned? And again, what options could be added to ensure all learners are able to comprehend the curricular content? Because comprehension in this one is so important. If they can't comprehend, if they can't access, they can't comprehend. And if they can't comprehend, they can't engage. And therefore, we're not creating opportunities and challenge for them. So the third one then, which is the strategic principle, multiple means of action and expression. Again, 3 guidelines. The first guideline, physical action. So using strategies, tools, and technologies to promote the ability of every learner to share their thinking. Expression and communication. Allowing the learner to express their learning in flexible ways, using a range of tools and technologies with the gradual release of scaffolds to build fluency. And the third one then is executive functions. Support the learner's ability to create plans to achieve learning goals while monitoring progress and organising tools and resources. And if we flip that to thinking about using UDL as a lens to how we are enabling our students to demonstrate their knowledge and their understanding and their skills, thinking about how learners are expected to act strategically and express themselves, and remembering that this one is as much about communication as it is about the acting strategically. So bear that in mind when you have your UDL lens on for this one. So the first question is, does the activity provide options that help all students act strategically? So what options could you add to ensure that all learners can physically interact with the materials and respond while they're learning? And that physical interaction is really important. It won't always work if it's just a piece of text put in front of them. The second question, does the activity provide options that help all learners express themselves fluently? So what options could you add to ensure that the learners can express ideas and communicate while learning? And finally, does the activity provide options that help the learners, help learners physically respond? So what options could you add to ensure that the learners are able to plan and organize their own learning? And again, it's back to that strategic, that's self-direction, goal orientated, but you can see that the communication is there as well. At the workshop last night, we were shown a really good video of this in action, and it was a teacher who had noticed that there was a barrier to his students doing public speaking. So he put a module in place, and you could see across his lesson, you could see the 3 principles of engagement, representation, and action and expression, but they were so beautifully melded together. It was really lovely. I'm going to go after this and find the clip, and I'll put the link to it at the bottom of the video there. But what he did was he set, so it was like the GPS, he set the final learning goal. So the final learning goal was them to do a piece of public speaking, but there were alternative routes and alternative destinations. So the students could choose to do a public presentation in front of the entire class, to do a public presentation in front of a small group, to do a public presentation just in front of teacher, or to record their public presentation and send it to the teacher as a video. And what I loved, this really reminded me of some of our CBA work at Junior Cycle, and how we could be so creative in how students can engage with their classroom-based assessments. What I thought was lovely there was for the shy student, or the student who would have extreme anxiety standing up even in front of teacher, he really put the emphasis on in the times we're in, that like public speaking through webinars, through videos, is a very valid and important skill to have. So nobody was going to be feeling that one option was less than the other, and if they didn't stand up and look at someone face to face, that it wasn't as good a destination as the other students in the classroom. And then what he did was he put in the specifics. So we talked previously about teachers being very clear about what the end goal is, but also what they need to get to the end goal. So even though as teachers, because we do this in our sleep, it's just habit to us, but for our students it isn't. So just making sure that there were those checkpoints along the way. They were very self-regulated, and the students were very much directing themselves, but it was because that scaffolding or those checkpoints were there for them. So he gave them a choice of pieces of reading to do. He directed them to the type of audience that he wanted them to write for, and then gave them examples of that digitally on paper, at different levels. He gave them options then of reading it from a piece of paper, reading it from their phone, how they were going to go about it, and then the students were self-assessing each other. And at the end of that, he did an exit quiz with them. So he asked them to do the traffic lights. Did they feel they could present in front of the whole class tomorrow? Did they need a little bit of more work, or were they still really uncomfortable with it? Really, really nice video. It's just over 9 minutes, so I will find the link and put it at the end of that for you. But it really summarizes everything I've just said here in the previous slide. And then they finish with who were the guidelines for, and they go through a list, you know, designers, teachers, educators, and I just put it into one word, something I don't normally do here, as you know, but it's the guidelines are for everyone. And if we think about that, like, they are about inclusive practices, they are for everyone, and there's something in them for everyone. So just to bear that in mind as well. So that is it for today. Short and sweet. There are some really good videos in the chapter, and there's one, a basketball one on page, let me just go back in. It's on the effective principle, so it is on page 60, and there's two videos there: participation in a classic selective attention test, and then view others taking the attention test. And they're really good, and the explanation around attention grabbing and then sustaining attention is addressed in that. So I'd recommend those ones, and as I said, I will put the link to the other video at the end of this. Okay, chat to you all next week. Have a lovely day. Bye for now, Slán.